All right, peace and greetings, everybody. We are live, about to click
TalkShoe Live. This episode is being recorded and streamed live on TalkShoe.com. You are joining the online studio. You are unmuted and can speak with the host. Recording started.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Primordial Chaos Radio. My name is Brother Beniti. My co-host Raven will be joining us shortly. We have a special guest this evening. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Before we begin, just to give you information for when we get to the call-in portion of the show. The call-in number that people that are also watching live on YouTube that's streaming there. I'll give this number again as the show progresses. I'm going to put the number up there on the board. It's 561-962-1137. If you are calling in from TalkShoe when we get to that time to speak to our guest, it'll be 605-562-0444. It's going to ask for a PIN, which would be 134778#. And then that's the call ID. And then the PIN is 1 and the number pound. I will give that information again when we get to that portion of the show. I'm going to put in the call-in number for YouTube in the board. So when we get to that time, you'll be able to call in. All right. So let's just make sure we have everything set up here. Make sure we have everything up and running. All right. All right. Let me see. Make sure we have Brother Baal. Kadmon. Baal, are you there?
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Perfect. Good evening. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. How are you? Thank you for having me on the show again.
Oh, no. Thanks for coming on. It's a pleasure to definitely get you here. And I know you're extremely busy. If you could.
It's been pretty busy the past few months, yeah.
Yes. And well, the book we're going to talk about, I mean, not just that book, but we're going to focus on your new book, which in my opinion, is incredible work. But before we do that, could you briefly, I know majority of my listeners are familiar with you, but just in case we have some newer people tuning in, if you can just briefly introduce yourself, give a little background about yourself to some of the newer listeners.
Sure. I'd be glad to. Well, I've been a practitioner of the occult for about 30 years now. And it all started from my Middle Eastern background. I was sent off to Israel as a disobedient child from New York City, where I am right now. And it was there, actually, that I had my first, I guess you could say, true connection to the occult from just an experience that I had there. And I had no idea where it was going to go or what was going to happen. And, fast forward several years later, and I realized that this was sort of the path that I needed to take. And it took on many different forms over the years.
Right.
And this is where I am now. And I realized, this is something that I need to teach, something that I need to bring to the world, my perspective, my understanding. I speak Hebrew and Aramaic, and I can read Greek and Latin and all these languages that I've learned over the years. And I feel that I can bring that as an asset to the occult community. And that's pretty much where I am right now. And I'm very honored to be able to do that because it is a responsibility. It's a great responsibility, and I don't take it lightly. And I'm just honored to be able to do that right now.
Right. And I will say this, I know myself and my listeners, one thing that's very unique about your work, you have so much information, but you have a way of conveying it that's not complicated. And I like the way you put the rituals and the work in your books. You make it very simple for people. You don't make it too complex. Now, this new book, but before we begin, all Baals books, I know you have your website. If you can give your contact, your website. I know all your books are available on Amazon, but I know you also have a website. If you can give that to the people too, I know they can go there and find your stuff.
Yeah, they can go to Kadmon.com and occultcourses.com. That's where most of my more intense, longer video courses will be. But Kadmon.com is where everything is.
Okay.
But really, in the end, Amazon is where everything is, because
Right.
Amazon is the monster of this new era. So
That's
that's
right.
where everything is, really.
That's right. So what we want to kind of focus on tonight, and obviously we won't be able to get through all of this because it's a lot. Your newest work, which I've been putting out there, Devils, Demons, and Ghosts in the Hebrew Tradition, Romance in the Sitra Achra. It's a very long work. I'm about halfway through. I know you sent me the digital. I actually went and got a hard copy. This is something I also have to have a hard copy of because of some of the work that you have in there. But let's start with the title. I have some sections planned out. If we browse through it. Anything you want to add, feel free, Brother Baal. And in the second portion of the show, we'll take some questions for you online, and then we'll take some calls for you. Well, let's start with this. What inspired you to put this together? Let's start there first. What was the inspiration behind this?
Well, I read, countless occult titles over the years, obviously, as you can imagine, and I'm sure all of you have as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's different for someone who can read those languages when you read it from the perspective of, wait a minute, what is this actually saying? Because most of the translations, they're in English, and a lot of people they cannot read the Hebrew or the Aramaic, and I consider myself fortunate only because I grew up in a background that allowed me to do that.
Right.
Because my father's side, they're Middle Eastern. So when I was exposed to these, the English translations, and I knew that there were Hebrew and Aramaic origins, I started reading them, and I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like something that would be said in Hebrew,
right,
or something that would be said in Aramaic. And I was like, well, let me do some research here and let me look at it. And then what I found was that the English translations are way off.
right.
And in addition, there are texts that haven't even been translated yet into English. And so I was like, well, this is a great opportunity for me to bring what I can bring to the occult community through the language, and to clarify everything. And that's why I wrote it. Because I've been reading many things about the Sitra Achra, the Klipot, and all of these things, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's something missing, because the original texts aren't really being translated properly. And it's not out of any type of ego or anything like that. I'm literally looking at the text. I'm like, wait a minute, the English translations are not doing justice to it. And the problem is that a lot of authors now are reading or using English translations of other English translations. So all of a sudden, all of these things get lost, and the message is completely deformed by the time it gets to the reader.
That is correct.
And the problem is that a lot of authors don't know that that's happening. And it's not their fault. I'm not blaming anyone.
Right.
If you don't speak Hebrew or don't read Aramaic, then that's not your fault. I mean, I just happen to be in a situation where I can. So I decided, let me just put this out there and say, look, this is what's really out there in the Hebrew and the Kabbalistic traditions from the original text. Okay, it's not syncretic in any way. I'm a syncretist in the sense that I actually like to combine traditions.
Right.
But this was a book specifically about Hebrew and Jewish traditions as it pertains to demonology and ghosts and the idea of the devil, but from a uniquely Hebrew and Jewish perspective. And the reason why I did that is because that is where a lot of this information comes from.
Right.
So you have all these books on the klipot. Where does that idea come from? It comes from the Hebrew and the Jewish traditions.
Correct.
But again, they're using English upon English upon English translations. And here I'm giving directly from the Hebrew Aramaic to English.
Correct.
And that's why I did that, to sort of clarify. And a lot of people have contacted me and said, my God, some people, it was so intense for them. They were like, look, I have to put this book down because, I mean, you're saying stuff that I never thought I would ever hear or read.
That's right.
And actually, that wasn't my intention. I was just giving information.
Right.
But it turns out it actually influenced people in ways that I had had no idea that it was going to happen. I swear I didn't.
Right.
But I'm happy it did because people are learning so much about it.
Big
and
time.
by the way, I held back. I could write 2 other books on this because I held back. Because there's so much.
Right.
There's so much. I was like, there's no way I could write all of this in one book.
Exactly. I mean, you went in depth. And one more quick thing on the language, and you do a good job in the book of it. For maybe people, and I always encourage people, look, I'm not saying, like I said, you're fortunate you were raised in that background, so you have a little more roots in some of those Semitic languages. But I've always encouraged people to understand the etymology, a lot of these words, at least get the basics down because of what you said. When it comes to the Bible, the Apocrypha, the Torah, all the books on the Bible, you're right. There's so many translations out there, and the more you study and research, like you say, it goes from bad to worse. But one thing you differentiate, and I've always told people this, if you could explain, if you can a little bit touch on the difference between Yiddish and Hebrew. Sometimes people get a little bit confused with that. They're connected, but they're not quite the same thing. If you could touch a little bit on that.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting because my background doesn't actually speak Yiddish. We're the Middle Eastern side, but what Yiddish is the combination of Hebrew and German.
Right.
Okay. And that was a language, or I guess a permutation that was used by the Ashkenazi Jews, or and it's still used to this day, European Jews that lived in Europe. And so really it's a confluence of German and Hebrew. And it was used predominantly as a way to hide what they were writing and what they were teaching from the non-Jews.
Right.
Because we had a lot of Germans there, and they were like, they were persecuting the Jews. And so the Jews created this hybrid language, which actually formed sort of naturally. It wasn't like someone just sat there and said, okay, let's create a hybrid language. It just formed. And to make a note, the Spanish Jews did the same thing. They have a language called Ladino. And it's not Latino. It sounds like Latino, but it's not. It's actually with a D.
Right.
And it's Ladino is the confluence of Hebrew and Spanish for the same purposes. So it was really a confluence of 2 languages. So Hebrew and Yiddish are only related in the sense that they are Jewish in nature, but otherwise, if I were to throw out a Yiddish word to you, okay, and a Hebrew word to you, you'll see that there's actually, the Yiddish word will be written in the Hebrew font, but it'll be different. Like, for example, let me show you one word. In Hebrew, the word for bread is lechem. In Yiddish, it's broit.
Right.
So broit is closer to the German side, but it's actually written in Hebrew font. So it's a very different language.
Right.
That an average Hebrew speaker, if they heard people speaking Yiddish, they probably wouldn't understand it.
That's right. That's right. Good point. All right. I appreciate you clarifying that. So now I kind of want to jump around through your new book. And again, everybody, the book is available. It is out. It is available on Amazon. If you don't have it, it's available also in digital format. You can get it on Kindle. You can get a hard copy. I definitely recommend, if you are a studier and a practitioner of the occult, demonology, etc., this is a great book. In the very beginning of the book, you talk, and I'm glad you clarified this, because I've always looked at, per se, you mentioned in the very beginning about Kali and Lilith and how you really don't look at them as demons. And I agree. And the reason why, you use the term, people confuse fierceness, sometimes aggressiveness, or the intensity. Even Santa Muerte, the Holy Death, which I do a lot of work, and a lot of our listeners, they're also practitioners or the study of Santa Muerte, the Holy Death. You even classify her not really as particularly what one would label a demon. Can you kind of explain to listeners, when you say you more perceive them in your perspective, because that fierceness sometimes, before we get into some of the demons and then the Citra Aqua, that's going to be a little more complex. Relay to the listeners why you came up with that, or how you explain it in the book, that sometimes we can, and I'm in agreement with that, because I've always perceived the same thing, because I think there's a lot of people get fascinated with Lilith and Kali, in a sense. So can you explain that concept you explained in the book about the fierceness sometimes gets confused with that?
Right. No, it's a great thing to get into, because what I find is that in the West, especially in the Western conception, and when I say Western, I'm talking more like Judeo-Christian.
Correct.
And we have this idea that ferociousness and fierceness is not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
Okay. We perceive it as being perceive aggressiveness as being some type of evil.
Correct.
And that actually became that way after the advent of Christianity, because Christianity brought about a kind of, I guess you could say, a pacification, right, of God, quote unquote God. So then all of a sudden Jesus and God are turning the other cheek. It's all about mercy. And so anything, again, because Christianity not disavowed the Old Testament, but sort of said, well, there's a New Testament. The Old Testament is sort of, we use it as a backup.
Correct.
And so then fierceness became an evil quality. And the thing is that there's nothing wrong with fierceness in every other religion but Christianity.
Correct.
Because even in Judaism, Yahweh, or Yehovah, as it is pronounced in Hebrew, he was a pretty mean motherfucker.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right.
He was vicious. He was fierce.
Violent.
He even said, I create evil. He put people on fire. I mean, he was no, walk in the park. But it really, the problem with fierceness and ferociousness comes from the Christian side. And so when Christianity looks at deities such as Kali, as Lilith, right, as and even in modern day as Santa Muerte, right, they're looking and they're like, oh, they're not Jesus, so they're demons, they're devils, they're ferocious. Look at Santa Muerte; she's the patroness of transvestites, of drug addicts, of gang members. Right. And the Christians don't like that. They don't understand it. Actually, that's where the rub lies, is that they don't understand it, and they disavow it. They disavow it all completely, because no, God is only love. Right. God is only light. And so they can't view it. So we can't confuse ferociousness and fierceness with evil because, again, we have that in ourselves. I mean, look, if someone comes to your house, okay, and they want to rob you, or they're going to break through, are you going to be like, you know what, here's my other cheek, why don't you shoot that, why don't you slap that? You're not going to do that, right?
That's right.
You're going to be like, you know what, come at me, and I'm telling you, you're going to get out of here in a body bag.
Exactly.
Okay? That's ferociousness. But
Correct.
that's not evil.
Correct.
That's not evil.
Correct.
You know what I mean? And so I think that's where the Western religions have a problem. They don't fully understand that fierceness is not evil.
Correct.
Okay, it's not the same. And they have to remember, God the Father was fierce.
Correct.
It was fierce. And so if we remember this, then they would be like, oh, well, actually, you're right. There is no, it's not evil, you know, so it's just ferocity.
Correct. All right. So what I want to do is in the book, which I find interesting because I think some people, and I talk about this a lot, you got a great section in the book on the aspects of Satan. I think some people, some of the titles, names, they confuse Azazel, Satan, Lucifer. Some people confuse that as all being the same thing. And we've talked about this in length. It's not Baal. You even get into Baal in there, etc. Can you touch a little bit on that? Explain the difference. Let's start with some of the familiar ones. The term Satan. Let's deal with Baal, Samael, Azazel. Can you explain how they have different functions and the type of classification we would classify these demons as you kind of break it down in the book? Can you kind of elaborate on the different aspects of Satan a little bit?
Sure. The thing is that the problem with doing this work, and that's why in my book what I did is I started from very general ideas and then worked my way down into more specific ones, is because in the Bible itself, and we're talking about the Old Testament completely. I'm not talking about the New Testament at all.
Right.
The Old Testament is that all of these names, Satan or Satan and Baal, or who is Belial, are names that in the Old Testament are used more as descriptions of something. Satan, you know what I mean? So they're descriptions of something. So Baal or Belial is used as a term for worthlessness, plague, disease, but then Satan and Baal and Asmodeus and Azazel, they all take on a different characteristic when you leave the Bible. Okay, when you're in the Bible, it's very ambiguous. You're not actually sure what Azazel is. I mean, people are like, well, if you read it, it's like, wait, is Azazel being or is it a description of something? But when you leave the Old Testament, then you get a better description of what these beings are. And the thing is that when you look at the different texts, we have Samael, we have Satan, and just so you know, Satan or Satan, it's probably a catch-all term when it comes to Judaism. When it comes to Christianity, it's a very specific being, but
that's right.
In Judaism, Satan is a very catch-all term. So Satan can be Azazel. Satan can be Samael.
Right.
Satan can be Baal or Belial or Belial. Mm-hmm. So in Judaism, it's not quite clear who Satan is exactly. But in Judaism, it's many different names.
Correct.
And the thing is that there's a beauty in that, because what it's really saying is that they're all, as I said in the book, a Satan. So it's in the Hebrew it's ha Satan, the Satan. but it's not like Satan as an individual being. So it's like Samael is a Satan, Azazel is a Satan,
Right.
and Belial is a Satan. So it's really a catch-all term. But really, in Judaism, Samael, there is no doubt about it. Samael and Asmodeus or Ashmadai are probably, and Lilith, of course, are the three that I would say that are the most prominent. I mean, we have Azazel, and Azazel shows up maybe a handful of times in the Jewish tradition, but really, and even Mastema, which is another term used, but really it's Samael, Ashmadai, or Asmodeus, and Lilith as really the trifecta of the demonic realm.
Correct.
So is there a difference between them? There is, but there isn't at the same time.
Correct.
In some texts, they're actually all considered to be sort of the one same being.
Correct.
And that's really tough. That's really tough for religious students. That's really tough for the occult, because we look at them and we're like, wait a minute, they're very distinct. But in fact, in Jewish tradition, they're sort of the same.
Right.
They're just different names of the same being. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Appreciate you clarifying that. Now let's get into obviously the foundation of the book, the Sitra Achra. But can you first explain the connection? Obviously, we can't leave out the clip pot. If you can kind of show how they're connected, and then kind of take it to the Sitra Achra. I know some people are, familiar with the clip pot. They may not be familiar with the Sitra Achra as much, but you distinctively describe both of them and their functions in the book. So can you kind of connect the two and how do they work in correlation with each other?
Sure. I mean, actually, they're essentially one and the same. They're just two different names for the same general concept. So the klipot, okay, or is a concept that it's very difficult to wrap your head around it, because the klipot are a product of a primordial event that occurred. And so this event was during essentially the creation of the known universe. So when there was at one point, and this is where some people say, this is where the Big Bang comes into place, because there's that one singularity.
Right.
So let's use that. Let's use that as an example. So there's this singularity, okay, that exists in space, wherever this space is. Okay, that's another question that could take us, many, many years to understand. What is that space that singularity was in?
That's right.
But anyway, so then in the Kabbalah, there's this understanding that God needed to sort of understand himself, which is a very odd thing to hear, because we're thinking, God is, omniscient and transcendent and everything. But in the Kabbalah, it really is. It's sort of God needing to sort of see himself in some way. And so what he does in the Kabbalah, according to Kabbalah, he contracts upon himself in something that is called the Tzimtzum. And then that empty space, that from his contraction, he shoots. Again, we're using very, mediocre terms for this, because there's really no real way to explain it. Shoots a beam of light straight from the Ein Sof, which means there's essentially nothingness, or like there's no end to it. And in the process of this creation, it unfolds in these 10 emanations, these 10 characteristics, I guess you could call them, from Keter to Binah, Chokhmah, and all of the 10 emanations. Now, the problem is that these emanations that are supposedly supposed to contain the energy of God, or his energy through the Ein Sof, is so intense that it shatters all of these sfirot, all of the essentially destroys the tree of life.
Mm.
Not fully, but partially. And so what happens is that literally the parts of the tree of life are shattering, literally like glass. And so those shards of glass that are shattering, now picture this in an energetic form.
Right.
Okay. They're literally, it's literally a dysfunction in creation. That's really how it's really portrayed, a dysfunction or like a crisis in creation. And these shards fall, okay? And they fall from the top and they keep on going down. And the problem is that as they're going down, they're literally developing like a skin around them.
Right.
And that skin or that shell is called a klipa. In Hebrew, klipa means shell.
Right.
So what's happening is that it's literally divine energy encapsulated in these shells.
Right.
And the thing is that Samael and Lilith are according to some traditions, are the perpetrators of this divide.
Mm.
And this is where, like I said in the book, the rabbinic traditions, sort of go from left to right. They're not consistent because in the beginning you have just like these klipots that are occurring, but then you have these other texts that say, no, Samael and Lilith were created specifically for this purpose.
Right.
So Samael and Lilith are essentially responsible for this malfunction in creation. And that's where the Sitra Achra comes in, because Sitra Achra just means the other side.
Right.
I mean, because there's the Sitra Kedusha, which just means the side of holiness, and then there's the Sitra Achra, which is the other side, or of unholiness. And so we have Samael and Lilith that essentially, when it happens, they are nurturing the klipot. Okay, they are nurturing that side of the tree of life. So I guess you could say it's the left. It's sort of like the left-hand tree of life, or the dark, or the death, or the tree of life, or the tree of death, essentially.
Correct.
And so that's where they come together. It's a very obscure concept because there's so many different teachings that putting them together, it's sort of like putting two pieces, you have a puzzle in front of you and you have two pieces that don't exactly fit, but you know what you do? You sort of cut one of the pieces
Right.
and to make it fit, and that's exactly how it is, because in the Jewish tradition, especially in the Kabbalistic tradition, you can literally, one chapter says this, the next chapter says that, and it's so different that it's like, wait a minute, how do you reconcile it? And the things that you can't, you sort of have to take it and see how maybe intellectually you can do it. But really, it is about taking pieces that not necessarily don't fit together,
And
cut
making
them so they do.
Right. What I would like to do, because what you're actually explaining, you have a section in the book, and there's a section, the Klippa and the Sitra Achra. I want to read a short paragraph in the heading of the caretakers of the Sitra Achra, kind of what you just explained. But some of the verbiage, I want to make sure you clarify some of this. And again, maybe more so for newer people to the path, or people that are just interested in studying in this area, so there's a clear understanding of it. All right, I'm just going to read this short paragraph because a lot of what you just said is kind of summed up in this paragraph. You say Samael and Lilith are the caretakers of the unholy tree of life. And I want to clarify that word because some people hear that and they get a little spooked out. Samael, whose name means poison of God, is the feeder energy of the tree. From him, the klipot are fed a steady stream of energy. Lilith, on the other hand, is a receiver of this energy, which she then transmutes into the world. she is the dark counterpoint to the Shekinah, or the holy presence, that is often associated with the last Sephirah called Malkut, in which our entrance resides. In this way, she takes the energy from Samael and infuses it into Malkut in an attempt to dim the divine light of the holy presence. In this sense, she and Samael are the vessels in which all the klipot exist in and through. Now, a couple things I want to point out, because some people will hear the word unholy, poison, dark. But I find one thing interesting, and for those that might have walked the path of Rosicrucianism, which I went through, they call the central part of where the presence of the divine dwells the Shekinah. They actually call it that, inside the lodge or the temples. So if you can explain, when you say the unholy tree of life, and because some might read this and not be on this path and think, well, that doesn't sound too positive because it could be perceived the wrong way. Can you kind of elaborate on this particular? I know you just kind of went into it, but when you say the unholy tree of life and how they are this, you just kind of describe it. But when you say steady stream of energy, how one kind of, in a sense, can't exist without the other, can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, let's deal with the term. In Hebrew, it's Shekhinah, okay, or Shekinah, in English.
Right.
Shekinah is the term, some people say it's the Holy Spirit. Some
Right.
people say it is the divine feminine within, the Hebrew tradition, in the Kabbalistic tradition. So what I was saying in that passage is that Samael and Lilith are literally almost like a separate existence that exists aside from, because remember, Judaism is a duality.
Right.
Okay, Judaism believes in duality, and that comes from Zoroastrianism, and I say that in the book, and I don't go too deep into that, but it's written there. And so, literally, they are the left-hand path of the tree of life. And so, Samael is, I guess you could say, the equivalent of God in the right-hand path. So, Samael is the left-hand path God.
Right.
For lack of a better term, I'm just going to use those terms because it's easier to use.
Right.
In the Kabbalah. And Lilith has always been equated with Malchut, which is the last or the final Sephirah in the tree of life, which incorporates the earth, which incorporates our universe, everything that is material. And so he feeds her and the energy of the klipot, because remember, we have the klipot that occurred, and within the klipot are their own universe. They have their own existence. And so Samael is essentially the quote-unquote king of that universe, and Lilith is the queen. And again, these are just, these are anthropomorphic terms that we use just to make these ideas easy to understand, because otherwise it would be impossible to understand them without them. And so she is the receiver of this energy, and what she does with that energy is push it out into the world. And I use the term unholy because that is the term that is used in the Jewish tradition.
Right.
Okay, I have no problem with Samael personally and Lilith, and so I don't consider them quote unquote unholy.
Right.
But really, what unholy means in this sense is counter to Yahweh, essentially. Counter to Elohim, counter to Yehovah, which is Jehovah. But Yehovah is actually how Yud Hey Vav Hey is pronounced, and there's many opinions that it can be pronounced in many different ways. So Samael and Lilith are literally counter to Elohim, Yehovah, El Shaddai, and Adonai, and all of those names. So it's literally a parallel universe that happens to be engrossed in our world. So that's why I call it unholy, because technically the divinity, the God, the Elohim, and Yehovah are the quote-unquote holy ones. And so Lilith would be the unholy. But again, as I said, even in the book, I don't necessarily consider it that way, but this is how those texts say it.
Sure.
And so, yeah, so that's really where the holy, unholy comes from.
Right.
It's anything that is essentially against the God of the Old Testament is unholy.
Correct.
In the Kabbalah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Now, there was something you mentioned earlier, and if you could elaborate, and I know from doing, when you do research, these texts, and you mentioned something about, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. When you read that Old Testament, there's a lot of bloodshed, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of animal and blood sacrifice. And I find in my conversations with Christians that per se may look down or frown upon the occult, or might look at certain spiritual traditions or African spiritual systems that advocate, animal sacrifice and working with these different aspects. What when we're classifying these gods and these spirit, what kind of God are we dealing with here? We're speaking from an occult perspective. What kind of God are we really dealing with? Because it doesn't seem to be this peaceful, all-compassing, all-loving God. It seems like there's for lack of a better word, an agenda there. So in your research through the word, like when you look up this God, and what have you uncovered and found? What kind of God are we dealing with here?
No, that's a great question, and it's a loaded one. Oh my God, that's like loaded like a machine gun, man. But let me just tell you, this and actually, I'll tell you the truth. The Old Testament God, and I'm just going to call him by the Hebrew name,
right, that
actually Jews don't want to mention. Remember, how we have Jehovah and all those, but in Hebrew it's Yehovah, right? And no Jewish person can pronounce Yehovah. So right. You know what? I'm going to use the term Yehovah going forward. So Yehovah, okay, in the Old Testament is a vengeful God, is a jealous God, is a God of actually, I'll tell you the truth. If you look at Satan within the Old Testament, Yehovah, far more. We have to be careful of God the Father more than we have to be careful of Satan. At least Satan tells you when he's coming.
That's right.
Yehovah does not.
That's right.
So the thing is that, yeah, exactly. So what we're dealing with is a very complicated thing here, and actually, the psychiatrist Carl Jung had a great idea about this, and he wrote in his book "The Answer to Job," and it's a great book. I'll tell you, Carl Jung's work is completely dreadfully dry.
That's right.
But if you want, if you have the time and you have the nerve to read it, you can, but you're going to have to read like 2 pages a day because this stuff is like completely dry. But
gotcha. He
has something very interesting there. He talks about, he's really analyzing what happened to Job. Okay, like we have the book of Job in the Old Testament where Satan, this character, Satan, only shows up in the first part of the book.
That's right.
He says to God, to Yehovah, and he says to him, look, here's your servant Job, let me fuck with him a little bit.
Exactly.
He's not gonna stay faithful to you. Right? And so God is like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna throw the dice here. Let's go for it. Okay, go to him now, take away everything that he has, but don't kill him. Right? So that's what happens. So Satan's like, okay, I'm game. Let's do it. Throw the dice. He goes down there. He takes on. He destroys Job's. It takes away his wealth. It kills his kids and all this stuff. But Job was like, you know what? No, I'm still faithful. I'm going to keep on going. And so then again, Job comes up to God. God is like, oh, you see, you just took out everything that he loved, but he's still faithful. So Job is like, you know what? No. Okay, how about this? How about I inflict him with all sorts of stuff? And God is like, okay. You know what? Give him disease, give him plague, whatever you're going to do, but don't take his life, right? So Satan goes back down, says, all right, I'm going to fuck with Job again. I'm going to give him disease. I'm going to give him all sorts of stuff.
Right.
And he doesn't break. And all the people he loves are telling him, just forsake God and die, man.
That's right.
I mean, look at what he's doing to you. And Job is like, no. I'm going to keep on going. Okay? And what happens when he keeps on going? Yehovah berates him. And he actually tells him, you are a worm. You are nothing. I can do whatever I want with you.
Correct.
And all this stuff. So although Job being devoted to God, God is still berating him. And then he says, you know what? Okay, Job, you're fine. I'm going to give you twice as many kids, twice as many goats and sheep or whatever the fuck you had.
That's right.
And that's it. So what did Carl Jung say about that? And Carl Jung said that essentially Jesus, so Jesus Christ was an atonement for Job, so that God essentially repented for what he did to Job and said, you know what? I'm going to send it myself. I mean, it sounds weird, but I'm going to send myself to suffer the slings and arrows of humanity to make up for what I did to Job.
That's crazy.
And it's very funny to hear that, because he also goes on to say that he does a psychological analysis of the God of the Old Testament, because the God of the Old Testament doesn't know his left hand from his right.
That's right.
And it's amazing. So the God of the Old Testament is a very questionable being. I think the Gnostics may have had it right, where they said, maybe it's the demiurge. Maybe the God of the Old Testament is the demiurge, that he's not necessarily a holy being at all. And I mean, I guess you could say that the jury's still out on that.
Right.
But that's the thing. When you really think about it, the Hebrew conception of God is far worse than anything we read in the demonic literature.
Right.
Far worse.
And it's funny, because that story there the Job story always stood out as some real sick, twisted two dudes playing this little game, pretty much making this bet. Pretty sick, twisted story. From the angle I've looked at it, there's so many things with this God of the Bible, because even when you go into the Old Testament, God is a jealous God. I mean, I never understood how the omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing God can be jealous. That's a human emotion. It just never made sense to me. And even in that story where Adam and Eve, so-called, ate the forbidden fruit, he returns back. It says he's walking in the garden in the cool of day, which I found that a little abnormal. And he doesn't even know where Adam and Eve is. So that's why I say, what is this? I mean, we're looking at this particular God. I mean, I don't know if the writers and the translators got some of this wrong when they were trying to translate this stuff, but it seems to be a lot like what you're talking about here. There's a lot more to this. It doesn't, because now when you get into the New Testament, I know that's a whole nother thing. We're not going to really get into that, but they present it as, you would get confused and think everything is just peace and love and harmony, but it's like a contrast of night and day between the Old Testament God and how it's presented in the New Testament. So it's just it doesn't
Right.
doesn't really make any
Well,
sense.
yeah, that's exactly it. And that's why Carl Jung wrote that book. He was basically trying to say that Jesus is redeeming his own Father. So he came in a way to be a filter for God the Father. So when God the Father is like, you know what, I'm going to fuck you up, Jesus is like, no. You know, let's filter this a little bit. So that's really what the answer to Job is about. It's about how Christianity saved God from himself.
Right.
And that's I mean, it's huge. I mean, but like I said, you can read the book, but let me tell you, it's very short. The answer to Job is short, but I'm telling you, your eyes will bleed blood within 3 pages of this thing. Okay? Because it is so dry and so technical. But, you know, it's worth reading if you sort of want to get a, you know, a psychoanalytic idea of how, you know, God the Father would be portrayed. It's a disaster. The Old Testament is a disaster, and I don't blame the people who wrote the New Testament saying, oh, you know what, the law of the Old Testament, those are gone.
Right.
You know, because I mean, Old Testament is just, it's ferocious. And to think that in Judaism, that because what is Judaism, what is the end goal of Judaism? The end goal of Judaism is for the third temple to be built, okay? When the third temple is built in Jerusalem, okay, Torah law will become law of the land again. You don't want that to happen.
No.
Let's put it that way.
No.
You don't want that to happen. Yeah.
No, because like I say, I don't know how you would keep all 613 of those commandments. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't make sense. I want to get to 2 last things before we take some questions and calls for you. I got to get into this because this particular quote in the Bible we frequently discuss. You got a section in there on the watchers, and you got a kind of breakdown on Genesis chapter 6, verse 1-4, where it talks about the sons of God saw the daughters of men. They came down, bore children with them. Who were these sons? Because there's so many theories on this. There's so many authors have tackled this subject. From your research, and I know because you went into the root of the languages, who were these sons of God that came down and had children with these women because they looked at them and saw that they were fair and this and that? Because you correlate this kind of to the foreign gods. I know you get into Reshef a little bit, which maybe we can get into that real quick. But in your research, who were these sons of God? Where did they come from? Or what is the origin of them? And what is this passage really conveying to mean?
Well, I mean, that's, again, a very, very loaded question there because there's so much to it.
Right.
If you read the various scriptures that are surrounded around this event, and I wrote a book just about the Watchers. I have a book called The Watchers and Their Ways. It's only about the Watchers.
Right.
Where this book, I just have a chapter on it. They are essentially an angelic, I guess you could say, army that has their original purpose was to actually, according to some of the more obscure Jewish texts, they were here to educate humans towards the divine way. But what happened was that they became corrupt. And it's very funny to hear that because when you read like what they call the Targumim, it says that the angels became corrupt from being here.
Right.
So in a sense, essentially that we as humans corrupted them. And then they used their power now that they are now corrupted, to teach us, you know, makeup and armory and witchcraft and all of these things. So the things that it's a large body of angels. They're called the Watchers. In Arabic, in Aramaic, it's Izin, and on Hebrew, it's Izin. And what they are is that they're not all quote unquote evil. Some of them have fallen, some of them have not. And so they are essentially angelic beings. Now, the question is, I think the more pertinent question is are these watchers necessarily the fallen angels? And that's the big question. Because remember, I mentioned in the book, in the current book, that there is a story about Samael. Okay, Samael, very close to the Islamic story, but the Islamic story clearly took from the Jewish one because it's much, the Jewish story is much older, where God creates Adam and Eve, or Adam rather, and says to the angels, bow down before him.
Correct.
Okay. And Angel Michael is like, okay, well, Angel Michael is the enforcer. So he says, all right, angels, let's bow down before this mud creation, right? So, well, that's exactly what he was, right? So Samael is like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so Samael is then cast down. So this is where there's potentially two falls, okay? We have Samael, who did not obey God's command to revere Adam. Okay, we have this in the Apocrypha, and Michael essentially says, "All right, well, get the fuck out," So and he gets out. So he falls to Eden. Adam and Eve are created, and then Samael tempts Eve. So Samael already fell with his angels. He already fell. And then we have, centuries later, the watchers falling from the heavens. So most people say, oh, the watchers, those are the fallen angels. But no, that is, I guess you could say, the second iteration of that story, because Samael already, with his angels, already fell in Eden. They already fell.
Right.
So that's why we have this conflicting story. Are there two falls here? So who are the watchers? Are the watchers angels that came later that said, okay, well, saw Samael fall about, 1,000 years ago. We're going to come follow him. So the thing is that, are these just two stories that are actually the same story, but they're written in two different ways? But really what I feel is that the fall of these angels came way early in the story. And that the fall of the Watchers and the Nephilim, that is a later story that was borrowed from an earlier one.
Right.
And so I really think that the first fall was Samael and his angels way before the Watchers. So the Watchers are essentially a newer story of an older one.
Correct. Yeah, it's amazing. Get many different viewpoints in that, but I'm glad you share your perspective on it, because it is a passage that's talked about. Because what it comes up is, I've even heard these theories when you read the story of Cain and Abel, and it tells you when Cain slew Abel, he was cast to the land of Nod, and he had the mark put upon his head. But the question that arises is, the mark was supposed to be, according to the story anyway, was supposed to be put on his head, so anybody that came upon him did not kill him. Now the question is, according to the lineage, there was nobody else alive but Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. So who? What? Yeah. So that's why I bring the Watchers in this passage up. Who would they be afraid of Cain encountering in the land or not? What bands? Is it possible that these were some of these bands that might have been residing there? I mean, we don't know, but is there any connection to that? That's why I kind of was bringing it up.
All right. Well, this is where the Jewish tradition is very inventive. There's two creations of man and woman.
Correct.
There's the first creation that says God created man and woman, and then later literally like a chapter later, he creates Adam and Eve.
Right. And you're talking,
So
you're right. You're talking in Genesis 1, verse 26 to 28, now Genesis 2, verse 7, but just so people can look it up.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly. So the first example, Genesis 1, that according to the rabbis, okay, according to Jewish tradition, when it says, "Oh, created man and woman," what he was saying is that he created man and woman already. He literally created them already,
right?
And that Adam and Eve were just the first humans that they are accounting for. That there were other humans there,
right?
Okay, but they were, in that first term that it says, created man and woman, those were other people that he created. So, but for some reason, he focused on Adam and Eve specifically. Now, in the second chapter, so what they're implying is that there were already people there. So Cain did not, sleep with, because in the Apocrypha, Adam and Eve also had daughters.
Right.
He did not sleep with his own sister.
Correct.
But there were people that were already in existence.
Thank you.
So that's the rabbinic way of explaining that away. Because it doesn't make sense. It's like, wait a minute, there's Adam and Eve, and then we have Cain and Abel. Where are the women coming from?
That's right.
Is Cain having sex with his own mother? I mean, what's going on here? But no, the first chapter, according to the rabbis, states that men and women were already sort of there. That there was this creation that was already there, and that they just happened to pick Adam and Eve as being the first ones. There was already people there.
That's right.
So that's the rabbinic tradition. There's like Kabbalistic interpretations that sort of hint to that.
Right.
But again, remember, these are all interpretations. We don't really know
right
what stories truly mean.
Correct. Appreciate that. Okay, and then the last thing I want to touch on, and then we're going to go to the phones, and we'll go to the chat, and we'll get some questions over to you. So people get ready to get those questions. I know already a bunch of you have typed in the chat already. I will give the caller numbers in the chat. I will give it out again in a minute on both platforms. You have a section in the back, and you even in the beginning of the book, you go through it a little bit. I want to focus on two particular spirit possessions you talk about. You have one called the Dabek, or some say the book, and the Ibor. Now, you mention in there, and these are the Hebrew aspects, one being for malevolent purposes and the other maybe being for benevolent. Can you explain? Because I think spirit possession is something that gets very misunderstood on this path, and understanding how that works and incorporated. So if you can explain the difference just specifically between those two. I know you get into a whole list of, obviously we'd be here all night. I'm trying to touch on some of the key points. Could you just kind of explain those two?
Sure. So in the Jewish tradition, there are two main forms of possession. One is called a dibuk, and one is called an ibul. And a dibuk, the term itself is already implies what it is. It's an attachment. It's debek. It's glue. It's on top of you.
Right.
Whereas an ibul is an impregnation, sort of like something that is emerging out. So a dibuk is a spirit